everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast. This week on the podcast, we're talking with Dr. Christine Johnson, Registrar and Affiliate Professor at Asbury Seminary. In this episode, we talk about how to build a theology of death, the relationship between death and holiness, and how to navigate our own mortality as a living people who can live without fear because we are a people of hope. Let's listen. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, talking about your study of death and holiness and the theology of John Wesley, and how we can just develop a theology of death as living people for it not to be something to fear. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to today. But I have to comment on your boots first. I always love your shoes.
Oh, thank you. Shoes are very important.
They are. And it's a great boot day.
Yeah.
So,
yes, it is. It's very rainy.
It is. Yeah. It is, yeah. So thank you so much for coming by.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about our conversation, too. A lot of times people don't want to talk about the topic of death. So I always joke that I have to have a captive audience in order to get anyone to actually listen. But I have been surprised at how many people have been interested in my work in the area, and that also have either had a loved one die, and suddenly this area of death becomes much more interesting and a topic of conversation.
Yeah, so. For sure. That's kind of where I am right now. It hasn't been something that I wanted to talk about because it was hard. But then as you get older, family members pass away, and being like, for me, I cry when I start thinking about it or talking about death, and wanting to learn ways to be, I might still cry, but to have peace in my heart about it and not be something to fear. Because I'm kind of like, this is something I don't want to talk about because I don't want it to ever happen, but it's part of living.
That's right. So, it's an inevitable part of life, right?
Yeah.
Is that we are all going to die because we're mortal creatures.
Yeah.
But somehow we have made the topic of death taboo in our culture.
Yeah.
So then it becomes very difficult when you either lose a loved one or you are ill yourself and are facing the prospect of your own death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you first become interested in this subject? Well, tell me what your subject is officially, for sure.
Sure, absolutely. Well, my dissertation was Holiness and Death in the Theology of John Wesley. And if you have read any of Wesley's works, you'll notice that the theme of death is incredibly prevalent throughout his writings. He struggled with the fear of death in some of his younger years, and when he was first starting in ministry. In fact, one of the more famous instances where Wesley struggled with this whole area of death was his encounter with the Moravians on the boat ride over to Georgia.
Oh, okay.
And they encountered this incredibly strong storm, and Wesley himself was very fearful about the prospect of dying, and people were screaming and crying and just in utter terror over the thought that they might perish. And he noticed the Moravians, and he said even their women and children were just calmly singing praises to God, and he asked them, "Are you not afraid?" And their response was, "No, we're not afraid to die." And that made such a strong impression on Wesley, because that fear of death for him made him recognize that he was actually lacking something in his faith and in his relationship with God. And then I know, it's really powerful.
Yeah.
And then, as he develops this theology of Christian perfection, or what you might call entire sanctification, he uses death as a metaphor for that work of God in the soul. And so I really became interested in how he is linking holiness with this kind of theology of death and dying.
Wow. So he was using death as a metaphor for the final sanctification process, is that?
Yes, for that work of Christian perfection or entire sanctification.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So how did you become interested in that?
Yeah, well, my topic actually came out of a conversation with my dissertation supervisor, Dr. Ken Collins.
Okay.
We had been talking about entire sanctification and just how Wesley, is describing this work of God in the soul, that it is, the death of the sin nature, and how oftentimes it looks like the death of us as well. And Dr. Collins had mentioned that there were these accounts that Wesley had published in his Arminian magazine of deathbed scenes or deathbed experiences of those early Methodists. And as I began to do research, I found out that there are over 280 deathbed accounts that Wesley published in his Arminian magazine that just described what it was to die, like these early Methodist experiences of dying. And they are such powerful testimonies that I was captivated and I couldn't turn away.
Wow.
However, there was also a bit of a personal aspect to this as well. When I was 17, my grandma died in our home. She had terminal cancer.
I'm sorry.
It was a difficult experience, but also a beautiful one. My grandma was a believer, and she died a very beautiful death. I know it sounds strange to call death
I know
beautiful.
What you mean, yeah.
But she died at peace and in love with the Lord, and just had such a strong testimony that when I came to Wesley's Theology, it finally gave me a framework for what I had experienced with my grandma's passing. And it was, it was such a powerful description of what can happen in the Christian life that I immediately kind of focused in on this area of death and dying, and I still love to talk about it.
Right. Yeah. As you think about it, it seems like a morbid subject, like we were saying, like a taboo subject, but it's one that's also full of hope too.
That's right.
Yeah. So could you tell us like one of those deathbed stories that you read about that kind of sparked your interest?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to choose just one.
I'm sure, yeah.
Like I'm already thinking about several.
It can be more than one. It's up to you.
No, what's really fascinating to me about the way that the early Methodists died is that they really did die well. So Charles Wesley had a doctor that wrote a letter to him. And in that letter, he said, most people that I encounter die, almost die out of this fear of death. Like they're not dying well. But your people, they're not afraid to die. Your people die well. And so that description, your people die well, really does describe these deathbed scenes, such that, Wesley didn't try to clean them up, because death can be kind of messy and ugly. Yeah. But yet he would describe the way that the grace and love and peace of God just reigned over their lives in that scene, such that you have these incredibly powerful testimonies. I think of a woman named Elizabeth Fluke, that she, was describing how on her deathbed, how she felt like she was just soaring over death. And so she, in her final moments, reached out her arms and proclaimed, "Wings, wings." Like she felt like she had these wings that she was just triumphing over death.
Wow.
And then there was an elderly man named Jonathan who would just continue to raise his hand. And they kept saying, "Jonathan, why do you keep raising your hand?" And he said, "It's my sign. It's my sign that I'm triumphing over death, sin, and the devil."
That's
and,
beautiful.
In his final moments, he just flung his hand up over his head and, died at peace with those around him and with the Lord. And, those are the scenes that it just makes me so excited to be able to share how we can die as believers. It doesn't have to be this terrifying event.
Yeah. So you talked about dying well. What does it mean to die well? Because as I think about it, I think part of it, you have to live well to die well. So it's a both and. So tell us a little bit more about what it means to die well.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head with the living well, right? Wesley described death in 3 different ways. Of course, death, he says, is a result of sin.
Yes.
And he talks about death as spiritual death, physical death, and eternal death.
Okay.
So when he talks about spiritual death, he recognizes that as a result of sin, we are separated from a holy God. And that separation, Wesley felt like, was the worst type of death of all. Physical death, of course, is a result of humanity's sin.
Right.
And eternal death he would describe as that final judgment, that final eternal separation from God. So when Wesley talks about redemption, redemption is really overcoming death in all of its forms, spiritual, physical, and eternal. Therefore, Christ's death and resurrection, in his atoning work on the cross, really is the story of us overcoming death, right? In whether it's spiritual, physical, or eternal. And part of that is, living or participating in the life of God. And to live well, Wesley would say, would be that we live the life of God, that we are living holy and pure lives. And if we live well, we'll die well. In fact, that's one of Wesley's kind of key phrases, that they died as they lived, meaning that they died holy deaths just as they died holy lives.
Yeah. Wow. So, because I've known people who, like you were describing, they just seem so at peace with what is about to happen. And at times I think they seem to know that it's going to be today or whatever.
Yeah.
And the people that I've known that has happened to have just been people that I think of as saints. But I think watching them, it doesn't seem like that it's dying. It just seems like it's going on living. And I think that's really beautiful. So they're not afraid. Yeah. So how do we see death as something not to be afraid of? I think maybe one of the things that maybe would be helpful to talk about is developing a theology of death. Would that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, back to Wesley's doctrine of holiness, right? Or this doctrine of Christian perfection. Well, what does 1 John tell us? That perfect love casts out all fear. And Wesley believed that not only could Christians become completely holy in this life, now he never claimed a sinless perfection, and that's a conversation for another day.
However, but that's an important thing to note, though.
Right, it is important, but that we could become perfected in love. And Wesley believed that that not only could Christians become perfected in love, that we also will become perfected in love. And oftentimes he said this kind of holiness looks like death to the self, right? That, if God's love is all in all, then where am I? Where's Chris Johnson in that? Or where is Heidi in that? And so that's why he's kind of using this metaphor of death when he talks about Christian perfection or being perfected in love. Well, we know that's not true, that the more holy we become, the more Christ-like we become, the more we become the people that God created us to be, right?
Yes.
But in our very warped perspective, it oftentimes looks like death. But in any case,
and it's an ending,
it looks like this ending. But for those who were approaching death, Wesley believed that oftentimes it was on the deathbed itself that people would become perfected in love. And those who have perfect love reigning in their hearts don't fear death because love has pushed out fear and sin.
But it sounds like it's one of those things that you have to get to that moment maybe before it happens. Like
that's right.
So I can look at it in the future and it seems like a terrible thing because fortunately I'm not there yet, but it's encouraging to know that work happens.
That's right.
And to have seen it happen for other people,
That's
too.
right. So Wesley actually dealt with this very topic, and he encouraged people because he had a young woman who wrote to him who said, Wesley, I'm not quite there yet. Like, I look at death and I still have some fear, some lingering fear. And Wesley was incredibly encouraging to her. He said, use the grace God has given you today. As you're not yet called to die, you have grace for living. But use the grace God has given you today, and he will give you the grace that you need for tomorrow.
So good.
It's so beautiful.
Yes.
But part of that using the grace that we have today means that we are actually to use this lifetime to prepare to die. Well, what does that mean? It means
what does that mean?
Yeah, it means that we should live the dying life, much like Paul called believers to in the New Testament, that we are to die to self, we're to die to sin, and that is a daily activity that we do.
Yes, it is.
And so we are called to live the dying life so that when it comes time for us to die, whenever that may be, that we have already done the work of the deathbed. We don't have to do that work we don't have to wait to do that work when we become ill. In fact, Wesley would say it's incredibly unwise to wait until we are sick to do this work, that it should be the life that we should live the dying life every day.
Yeah. Wow, that is so good. Yeah. So good. So we were talking about developing a theology of death too. Mm-hmm. Are there other ways that we can do that? Because I guess, I don't know if this is realistic, but I'm looking for, like, here's 3 things that you need to do or think about to, develop a good theology of death. But I don't even know if that is practical, because some things, it's not like 10 easy steps and there you go.
That's right. And it's not easy to die to self either, right?
No.
So, yes, to be faithful, I do need to say that Wesley is not, Wesley didn't come up with this. He's not alone in this leading the dying life. Within the Christian tradition, there has been the Ars Moriendi tradition. Well, what does that mean?
Yes.
It means the art of dying. And what that is it's a recognition that just as it takes time and energy and a full commitment to learn the art of anything, right? Mm-hmm. To do something well takes time and energy and commitment. So too the art of dying well takes our full commitment.
Yeah, it takes a lifetime.
It takes a lifetime. That's right. And there has always been this recognition within the church. Jeremy Taylor, Richard Baxter, others that Wesley read and that influenced him, that talked about using our life, using all of what we are in the here and now today to prepare for this moment of death. And once again, I'm going to go back to, what does that look like?
Yeah.
It looks like leading the dying life. It's practicing self-denial. It is being in the means of grace.
Yes.
It is leading the life that denies sin. This is a great phrase: sin, self, and the devil. Right? And really inculcating those holy virtues within the soul. Well, of course, we can't do that alone.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So that takes the grace of God, the work of the Spirit in our life, and being in Christian community.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I love thinking about it that way, because it's more about living.
Yeah. To die well means to live well, right?
Yeah.
There is a phrase one scholar uses, that the early Methodists, they were stealing a march on death. I
love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we put that theology into practice as living people, as people around us die, and that we start facing our own mortality?
Right. Well, I think this is what we're doing today is an important step toward that, that we actually have to start talking about our own mortality.
Which is hard.
It is hard, right? Mm-hmm. And it's, as I said, when we first started talking, this whole subject of death is taboo in our culture. We isolate the dying, we isolate the sick, They are not a part of our community. And so it becomes really difficult to have honest and open conversations about death and dying.
Yeah.
And we have not developed good theology around death and dying because we're not willing to talk about it.
Right. I think it's as if we keep them away, that it won't happen to us.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But of course, we know that's not the case. And so I think having open conversation is a good place to start. We also know that it's really difficult to live a life of self-denial and to oftentimes die to ourselves. And that's why Wesley called for Christian community, right?
Yeah.
That we cannot do this life alone. He said there's no such thing as a solitary Christian. And that means opening ourselves up to being accountable and to being in Christian community.
What do you mean dying to yourself? Because it's a phrase we use a lot, but I want to make sure we know what it means.
Exactly. Well, Wesley will describe this in a number of different ways, but probably one of his key sermons on this is his sermon on self-denial. And he talks about bearing crosses and taking up crosses. And he makes a difference between bearing crosses and taking up a cross. Bearing a cross are those circumstances that are out of our control. Like we all have crosses to bear, right?
For sure.
We don't get a choice in the matter. But Wesley said as we follow Christ, there will be a cross in the path that we will either have to choose to take this up and deny what our will is, what our self is, and to take up this cross and to continue to follow in the path of Jesus Christ. And what that looks like can often be times different.
Yes.
But Wesley will even push beyond that. And he will say that it is not just like giving up things or, oftentimes we think of taking up a cross is very negative.
Right, yeah.
But Wesley will look at this in a very positive sense as well, that it's even the good things that we do, those things that we kind of identify as parts of ourselves that are so good and that we've invested ourselves in, that even those things we need to be willing to surrender to God.
Like what kind of good things?
Like our ministries and those things that we've invested ourselves in, our work, like our...
Yeah, for sure.
That those too need to be surrendered to God. And Wesley said, don't look at this in a negative way, but look at this as opportunities for us to become more and more Christ-like and more and more alive in God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about time when I think about death and thinking about eternity and kind of no time. And that's hard for me to wrap my mind around and like how we fit in the time spectrum, because when death happens to us or to somebody we love, time seems to stop, but at the same time, it doesn't stop for everybody else.
That's right.
Yeah. And so, what does that mean, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah. I think it presents us with a really unique opportunity in those moments, because we live in the here and now, right?
Yes.
And we are so focused on the everyday world. And in those moments, we get a little glimpse of what it means to be an eternal creature. And that we actually are participants in something much larger, much greater than ourselves. And that we participate in the very life of God and in eternity. And I think those give us those moments that are often very painful, right? When you lose a loved one, and it feels like time has stopped for us in some sense. But it's also an opportunity to recognize that we participate in eternity. And that it helps us to remember that we need to not get so wrapped up in the temporal, but that there's something beyond the life of eternity.
Yeah, yeah. How can we respond when a loved one passes away with our good theology of death and like thinking about that? How can we respond?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I would say how the Methodists responded in Wesley's time is a beautiful picture. I'm sure you've know about Wesley's societies and classes and bands. No,
a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Wesley called people to be in community with one another, and he would put them in classes or in bands where they would encourage one another, and they would call each other to account. They had a list of questions that they would ask one another to encourage and to help prompt one another on in the faith.
Okay.
And as a person in one of these classes or bands would come to a point in time where they were either ill or dying.
Naturally.
Yes, exactly. When they were too ill to go to the class meeting would come to them. And they would be surrounded with this community of love and support, and they would surround the deathbed and ask them some of the same questions that they asked them while they were in full health. How is it with your soul? One of the questions that they would ask is, are you happy? Because Wesley realized that the more holy you are, the more happy or joyful that you were. And so these are the types of questions that are being asked, and they would covet the prayers of the dying person, and they would ask for their encouragement. So the loved one that was actually dying was still a part of the community, and they were recognized as a valuable part of the community of faith. And that is something that I think we've lost today. So,
yes,
as we see the approach of death, either for ourselves or for our loved ones, I think it's really important to still incorporate that person as a valuable member of our community of faith. And then, to be present with them. We tend not to want to be around people who are dying because it's very uncomfortable.
Yes.
But yet it can
we don't know what to say.
Yes. But it can be so beautiful. But I don't think we see that in our culture today because we're not around people who are dying anymore.
No, we're not. Yeah. How can we? I love that. Yeah. I love that so much. That's very beautiful. Like the communion of the saints, because you're on the edge of a saint who has gone on and being surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses, and I think that's beautiful.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, the person in the dying role, so to speak, became the most important member of that community, because the early Methodists believed that the veil between heaven and earth was very thin in those moments, and that person was closest to God. They were getting ready to step over into eternity.
Beautiful.
And so they really did take on this role where they were the most important person in the room, where their words and their prayers were coveted, and people just wanted to be close to them in that moment.
So as we think about this, sometimes we have unexpected passings of loved ones. How does a theology of death help to prepare us even in those unexpected times where it could seem like there is no hope?
Right. We are not people without hope, right?
Aren't we glad?
Yes, absolutely. Amen. We're told that we don't grieve as those who have no hope. And Wesley was asked actually very similar questions. A sudden passing was considered not to be a good thing. Like I encounter lots of people when they want to talk about death, they say, "Oh, I just want to die in my sleep," or "I don't want to know that it's happening." But
I think I want to be surprised.
Yeah, exactly. That's our approach. But that was actually not considered a good thing in Wesley's time.
Really?
Yes, because not only did it rob the person of this ministry to their community, but it robbed the community of their testimony or of their dying ministry.
Makes sense, yeah.
So, but of course, sudden deaths happen, right? And so Wesley was kind of asked this question: how do we respond to this? And Wesley's response, he's always an optimist of what God's grace can do, right?
Yeah.
And really, there is no surprise to God. And so we live our lives in God's grace, and God's grace always goes before us. And it is the recognition that even in these tragic, unexpected deaths, that God's grace was already there. Mm-hmm. And that God's grace will be sufficient in our lives as well.
For sure.
Even in the very painful and difficult moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How has what you've learned, because you mentioned your grandmother's passing, kind of sparking a personal interest in this subject, how has what you've learned kind of shaped and formed you as you've learned to think about this differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I really love about Wesley's theology is what I mentioned earlier, this optimism of what the grace of God can do in our lives. And oftentimes, we think, oh, well, I couldn't possibly live a life without fear, or I couldn't possibly, this thing that I struggle with in my life, this sin, we see it as kind of this false humility, right? Mm-hmm. That, we're only human. This is always going to be a struggle for us. But that is not Wesley's approach. Not when it comes to death, overcoming the fear of death, not when it comes to truly becoming holy people. Mm-hmm. And that is that God's grace is greater than all of our sin, right?
Yes.
And that we can truly live as people of hope, as holy people, and that it is a joyful life. It is a life that is filled with the power of the Spirit, mm-hmm. And that we really can be triumphant. It's so it becomes so evident when we look at these deathbed accounts, right? Yes. That was the one thing that was truly fascinating to me, is that Wesley has this really great theology, but how is it worked out in the here and now, right? How did it make a difference in people's life?
Yes.
And I think the deathbed is actually where we see this theology played out in its strongest ways. And that is that we don't have to approach death with this kind of fear and trepidation, because we can be assured, we can have full assurance that we are the children of God, that our sins have been forgiven, and that we are living in the love and the purity and the holiness of God, so that we can, like Charles Wesley's hymn, we can boldly approach the throne of grace because of what God has done in our lives. And that, to me, is just the most beautiful message.
I want to live as a person of hope, but I'm not quite sure how to do that. So how can I start doing that? Because I believe everything you just said, and I'm sure there may be people who are going to be listening to this who are like, yeah, I know that, but I don't know it in my heart. I mean, I do know it in my heart, but I still have this sense of fear and anxiety. So how can we become people of hope?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question, and one that Wesley, of course, would deal with in his own time. And I'm going to go back to that phrase, live in the grace that you've been given today.
That's
right?
beautiful, yeah.
And so what does it mean to live in grace? Well, Wesley's going to say to abide in the marks of the new birth, which are faith, hope, and love, to abide in the means of grace. God has given us so many ways, pathways to his grace, right? Like being in Christian community, like being in a class or a band, like abiding in Scripture, whether that's through our own personal reading or placing ourselves under the preached word. It is practicing the holy disciplines of prayer, of of being in Christian community, of fasting, of self-denial, all of those things that are these means of grace to us that have to be done daily, right?
Yes.
And it's not, oftentimes, people would criticize Wesley by saying, oh, you're just telling people to work for their salvation.
Right, yes. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. But Wesley's saying, no, these are avenues or pathways which God has already given us in order to receive his grace. Like, we oftentimes want to say, oh, well, I'm just going to sit back and, let God, kind of miraculously zap us,
Right. That doesn't work for any relationship that you have with another person.
Exactly. And really what it is it's placing ourselves in the avenues of grace by practicing these holy disciplines. So if I had any advice, it would be to, remain in the means of grace that God has provided us.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Thank you. Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about today?
I would just like to say that I would really encourage these continued conversations, because there are so many ramifications to us not talking about this topic of death. Even though it's difficult at times. We're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing.
Afraid we're going to cry.
Yes, afraid we'll cry, or, all of those things. It has so many ramifications, because, first of all, I think it's a tragedy that we are leaving people alone in these very difficult moments of their lives, their final moments of life, when we sit on top of such a rich heritage of, that we are people that are known to die well.
Yes.
And we have not put forth a pattern for people to follow, which is one of the beautiful things that we find in these deathbed accounts, is that people were familiar with death, and they knew what it would look like when it was their turn. And they knew that the grace of God had been there for others, and that God's grace would be there for them.
Yeah.
So, but that's for the dying person. But it also has ramifications for those of us who are left behind, right? We have not grieved well, and we don't know how to help people in grieving, because we can't talk about death, right?
Right.
And so it has left people incredibly isolated. And I just think that is a real tragedy, when we have been given such a great gift of hope and peace and grace, and could really help others in this difficult time. So if there's anything else I'd want to talk about, it's that we need to start talking about death more. I would just challenge, when was the last time we heard a sermon about death?
I don't know that I've ever heard one, or if I did, I blocked it out because I didn't want to face that. Yeah.
That's right. So, that was one of the strengths of this kind of Ars Moriendi tradition that Wesley was a part of, is that we don't leave death until we're facing end-of-life issues, but that we incorporate it every day in our spiritual lives, right?
Yes.
But that we also are very open and honest about our own mortality, and can use that to help others.
I like what you said just a minute ago about we leave people alone when they're dying, but then we also don't grieve well. I want to talk about that for a minute too. How can we grieve well, and I guess grieve with hope, because it doesn't negate the fact that you've lost something or someone.
That's right. Because Wesley, even though Wesley recognizes that, death has already been conquered through Christ, through the death and resurrection of Christ, it's still that last enemy to be conquered that won't ultimately be conquered until the return of Christ. And so we have this kind of odd relationship with death, right? That it is both that that last enemy of God, and yet it is that thing that propels us into the very presence of Christ.
Yes.
And so it's both seen as enemy and friend for believers,
Yes.
right? And so too, this issue of grieving, right? We can rejoice in the fact that our loved one has, gone to be with God. On the other hand, there's this very real separation. We miss them. We grieve them, sometimes every day.
Yes.
And this grief that we have, it is real, and it should be acknowledged. And it should be acknowledged in community. There is this really fascinating journal account where Wesley talks about this woman who had been physically ill. And she'd been to doctor after doctor, and they just could not help her. And Wesley finally sat down with her and began kind of trying to figure out what the issue was. And he recognized that this woman was in deep grief over the loss of her son. Yeah. And when she started, Wesley was helping her deal with this grief, the physical kind of manifestations of it, she was healed from. And there's this, there's a
connection between it all.
Yes, there's a connection between all of this. And yet, because we are so unwilling to talk about things like death and dying, like grieving, we're leaving people in isolation to try and cope with this on their own, and we miss real opportunities of ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So how did you get to Asbury? Because we're very glad that you did.
Yeah, I came to Asbury as a student. I came in, completed my MDiv here.
No way.
Yes, I did, and I have just never left. I went on, I actually lived and worked here while I was working on my PhD, and then...
Where did you do your PhD? You did?
Yes, through the University of Manchester, directly through the relationship with Nazarene Theological College.
Okay, cool.
And Asbury has a relationship with them, and so... It was a very hard life, but somebody had to lead it. I had to travel back and forth to England.
Oh,
and,
yes.
So
hard.
So hard, yeah. But it was really, I really enjoyed my program, and clearly am still enamored with my topic. It's been just a really beautiful journey, and I'm very grateful.
Yeah. So you were a student, and then you came back as the registrar? I
did, yes. So my primary role here is to serve as registrar, but I also do some teaching as well.
Yeah. What classes do you teach?
So I teach Theology of Wesley, of course.
Of course.
Church history, and then I also have team taught history and polity with a fellow faculty member.
Yeah. You should teach a class on this.
I would love to. I absolutely would love to.
Yeah.
There's just so much to talk about here.
So I'm really glad that we got to talk today, because I have a fear of my own family members passing, and for me it's my parents, and thinking about when I see them, is this the last time? Or other people, like uncles, aunts too. It's not just my parents, but is this the last time? And trying to savor every moment that we have together, but it's because of that fear. It's not out of that joy of we get to spend this time together. It's oh my goodness, what if this is the last time and I didn't enjoy it to the maximum possibility, and this is the last time that we get to see each other,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I can understand that, because I have family members who are also aging, and it does become an issue where we recognize that our loved ones are not going to be here forever.
Yeah.
I know I've had several encounters in my own family. My dad had cancer, and now, of course, he's beyond that, and we are very grateful to God for that healing. But I think he's had his own recognition of his mortality, and will oftentimes speak about, his, that he's not going to be here forever, right? And that's really difficult, right?
Yeah.
We'll get teary about it, and it's really hard. However, there's also that I recognize in some ways that the death of some of the loved ones that I have had, like my grandma, like my, we have to be real. My parents will pass, they'll die. And I can think about that makes, in some way, it makes heaven just that much more real to me. It almost, because I know, of course, we have this beautiful relationship with God, and we can be assured of our standing with God. But in some sense, it almost makes heaven tangible. That I know that when I die, that I'll see my grandma. I'll see my Aunt Kathy. That I'll see my friend Tammy Bennett, who passed away, and that it makes heaven real. That's the reality of it. And in many ways, it loosens kind of those ties that bind us, right? Here to earth. It makes heaven that much closer.
Yeah. Because I think my dad and your dad are similar in some ways. Because I know your dad was a firefighter too, my dad. And they both have had... My dad had open heart surgery, and I think that kind of started him thinking, and he's doing fine now, as is your dad, but just kind of started him and me thinking, because until that point in time, I had blocked everything out and was like, oh, yes, everybody I love will be here forever because I'm not going to think about it.
Right. Exactly.
And so now sometimes my dad will want to talk about it, and be like, hey, I'm not necessarily going to be around forever, and I'm like, Daddy, don't do that.
Because we don't. But I think it's really important that we provide the space for even our loved ones, the people that we never want to see die, because they're, our parents are an everyday part of our lives. And it's incredibly difficult to think about they're not being there. But on the other hand, it's important that we are able to address these, because it makes, it helps us deal with the death before it actually happens.
Right. And there is part of me that wants to have those conversations too, and talking about the pattern of dying well and surrounding the person who is dying to receive their prayers and their blessing, and to model how to do it well.
That's right. And I think we do need to create this culture again where we pattern for others what it means to die as a believer. And if we refuse to talk about it, or we don't want to talk about it because it's not something that we want to think about, that we lose those opportunities and those moments where, we lose something very beautiful, that it can turn from something that's terrifying and ugly into moments of beauty. And I think that's what I experienced with my grandma's passing, was that recognition that this was something so beautiful, her passing from this life into the next, that it gives us real hope.
Yeah, because we see it.
Yeah. It becomes a tangible thing for us instead of this theory that we've never experienced.
Right, and I can tell it's something that the hope is something that you really believe too, because throughout our entire conversation, it's just been radiating off of you, and I think that's beautiful too.
Well, thank you for that, Heidi. I appreciate it.
As we wrap up the podcast today, we have a question that we ask everybody on the podcast. So it's called the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast. And so what is one practice, it can be spiritual or otherwise, that is helping you thrive in ministry right now?
Yeah, I love that question, and I think my answer is going to be expected, and that is to abide in the means of grace, those means that God has given us. So practicing those holy disciplines, being in a group or a band where we can be accountable to one another and be encouraged by one another, and just really, living faithfully in our day-to-day lives.
Are you in a band right now?
Yeah, not a formal band, although I will say I have a group of people
Yeah.
that I can pick up the phone at any time and
You
say,
have a band.
I have a band, right? Where I can say, I'm struggling, pray for me. Or this is an area where I need some encouragement. And they can do the same for me as well. So in some sense, it's not a band that meets every week, but it is a band of believers that have surrounded me, and that I have been able to help in their lives as well.
That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So thank you for the conversation today and just helping us talk about it so that we don't have to be afraid. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for joining me for today's conversation with Chris Johnson. Grateful for the hope that she radiates about this topic that we often avoid, and for the gift that this conversation has been to me personally. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. Subscribe in iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast. You can follow us in all the places on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Asbury Seminary. Have a great day, y'all, and go do something that helps you thrive.